Americans across the Midwest are waking up to a reality that seemed impossible just days ago. The possibility of severe fuel shortages and dramatically escalating gas prices, not due to Middle Eastern conflicts or domestic production failures, but because of an unprecedented standoff with America's closest neighbor and ally, Canada. This isn't a typical trade dispute characterized by tariff negotiations and diplomatic communiques. Instead, it represents a fundamental shift in the North American economic relationship that has remained stable for over 7 decades. The crisis began with what appeared to be a straightforward executive decision, blocking the operational clearance of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a $9 billion infrastructure project designed to alleviate trade bottlenecks between the United States and Canada. However, this action triggered a calculated response from Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney that has exposed critical vulnerabilities in America's energy infrastructure and raised serious questions about the future of cross-border economic cooperation. The Gordie Howe International Bridge represents far more than a crossing over the Detroit River. This massive infrastructure project has been designed as the primary conduit for North American trade, intended to handle hundreds of thousands of commercial vehicles annually. For the automotive industry, which relies on just-in-time manufacturing processes, the bridge represents essential redundancy, a backup plan for when the aging Ambassador Bridge faces congestion or closure. When President Trump signed the executive order halting the bridge's final operational clearance, citing national security concerns about insufficient cargo screening and the potential infiltration of Chinese components into the American market, the immediate impact seemed contained. Federal agents were dispatched to physically block access ramps on the Detroit side, with concrete barriers erected on approach highways. The imagery was powerful: American strength, border control, and sovereignty on full display. However, the justification appeared thin to most trade experts. The bridge had undergone extensive planning, including comprehensive security protocols developed in cooperation with both American and Canadian customs agencies. The real motivation, according to political analysts, was leverage, an attempt to force Canada into a more subordinate position in ongoing trade negotiations and to demonstrate American power to a domestic audience. The tactical error in this approach became apparent within hours. Trump's team apparently operated under the assumption that Canada, with an economy roughly 1/10 the size of the United States, would have no choice but to capitulate quickly to American pressure. This calculation failed to account for a critical asymmetry in the relationship. While the United States may have a larger overall economy, Canada controls resources that specific American regions cannot function without. For 6 hours after the bridge blockade began, Ottawa remained conspicuously silent. No angry press conferences, no immediate retaliatory tariffs, no inflammatory statements from government officials. This silence was strategic. While American news networks speculated about Canada's response and Trump's team likely anticipated a traditional diplomatic protest, something far more consequential was being prepared. At 8 o'clock in the evening, ground sensors monitoring the Enbridge Line 5 and Line 78 pipelines, massive steel arteries carrying heavy Canadian crude oil beneath the Great Lakes into American refineries, began registering significant changes. The flow didn't stop entirely. That would constitute a clear violation of long-standing energy treaties and could be construed as an act of economic warfare. Instead, the flow rate decreased substantially. Canada's official announcement framed this action in precisely calibrated language. The government declared an emergency integrity audit of all cross-border energy infrastructure, citing grave concerns over American border stability and the need to ensure critical infrastructure is protected from civil unrest. This justification was brilliant in its construction. It used Trump's own chaotic actions at the bridge as the rationale for the audit. The implication was clear. Since the American government was creating instability at the border, Canada had legitimate reasons to verify the security of its energy infrastructure. This response represents a masterclass in economic statecraft. Rather than engaging in the kind of bombastic rhetoric that Trump excels at dominating, Carney chose a technocratic approach that is nearly impossible to counter politically. How does an American president argue against safety inspections? How does he claim that another nation shouldn't verify the integrity of its own infrastructure, especially when his own actions have created border chaos? The immediate effect was dramatic. The crude oil that Midwest refineries depend upon to produce gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel was now effectively trapped north of the Canadian border, available only in reduced quantities during the audit period. To fully grasp why this Canadian action represents such a significant threat to the American economy, one must understand the specific nature of the energy relationship between the two countries. This isn't a situation where the United States simply imports some oil from Canada as one of many suppliers. Rather, certain American regions have built their entire energy infrastructure around Canadian crude. According to data from the Energy Information Administration, states like Ohio and Michigan receive nearly 70% of their crude oil from Canadian sources. This dependency isn't merely circumstantial, it's structural. The refineries in these states have been specifically designed and optimized to process heavy Canadian crude oil. The chemistry of petroleum refining means you cannot simply substitute one type of crude for another without significant modifications to refinery equipment and processes. Texas produces substantial quantities of light, sweet crude, but the refineries in the Midwest cannot efficiently process this type of oil without extensive and expensive modifications. Similarly, while oil could theoretically be imported from Middle Eastern sources, the logistics of transporting it to landlocked Midwest refineries presents enormous challenges. The pipelines from Canada represent not just the easiest supply route, but in many cases, the only economically viable supply route. When Canadian oil flow decreases significantly, Midwest refineries have no choice but to reduce their output immediately. They must begin rationing their existing inventory, which means less gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel entering the market. With demand remaining constant and supply decreasing, basic economics dictates that prices will rise, potentially dramatically. The effects of the pipeline flow reduction manifested almost immediately across multiple sectors of the economy. Drone footage from the Ambassador Bridge, the older crossing that remains operational but is now handling all commercial traffic between Detroit and Windsor, revealed a traffic backup stretching 14 miles. This wasn't merely an inconvenience. It represented an economic heart attack for the just-in-time supply chains that modern manufacturing depends upon. Those trucks contained far more than generic cargo. They carried fresh produce destined for grocery stores across the Midwest, pharmaceutical supplies for hospitals, and critically, the specialized automotive components that Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler require for their assembly lines. When these parts don't arrive on schedule, entire manufacturing facilities must shut down, sending workers home without pay and halting production of vehicles already sold to customers. The logistics industry responded predictably to the uncertainty created by the bridge blockade. Major shipping companies began canceling routes or dramatically increasing their fees to account for the risk of delays. According to industry reports, the cost of shipping a container from Toronto to Chicago doubled overnight. This inflation in transportation costs doesn't simply affect the shipping companies. It cascades through the entire economy, as every product transported by those trucks becomes more expensive. Financial markets, which often react to geopolitical developments faster than the general public, immediately recognize the severity of the situation. The futures market for RBOB gasoline, the wholesale benchmark for gas prices, spiked dramatically as traders anticipated supply shortages. Professional commodity traders understand that when pipeline flow decreases and refinery output drops, retail gas prices inevitably follow. More alarmingly, petroleum inventory levels in the Midwest were already below historical averages due to seasonal factors. The region operates with relatively limited storage capacity, depending on continuous flow from Canadian sources. Even a brief disruption of several days could lead to localized shortages at gas stations. If the audit extends for 2 weeks or longer, analysts predict actual fuel rationing could become necessary, with gas stations posting "out of fuel" signs across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. What makes this crisis particularly significant from a political perspective is the geographic distribution of the impact. The states facing the most immediate threat of fuel shortages and price spikes, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, aren't random casualties of a trade dispute. These are critical swing states that determine American presidential elections. Trump's political brand has been built substantially on his image as a strong negotiator who puts American interests first and refuses to be pushed around by foreign powers. However, in this instance, his aggressive tactics have created a situation where his own voters in crucial states are experiencing direct economic pain as a result of his decisions. This represents a political vulnerability that opposition parties will certainly exploit. According to leaked communications from the Department of Energy to the White House, Trump's own advisors explicitly warned him about Canada's leverage over Midwest energy supplies before he signed the executive order blocking the bridge. The memo reportedly stated that Canada possesses the leverage to induce a regional energy shock within 48 hours, and that the United States does not have strategic reserves positioned to counter a supply reduction of this magnitude. This revelation is particularly damaging because it demonstrates that the crisis wasn't an unforeseeable consequence of complex geopolitical dynamics. It was a predicted outcome that Trump chose to ignore. He apparently believed that Canada would not dare to retaliate in a manner that could cause pain to Canadian interests as well, or that if Canada did respond, the American economy's larger size would allow the United States to endure the pain longer. This calculation misunderstood both Canada's willingness to accept economic costs to defend its sovereignty and the asymmetric nature of the pain distribution. While Canada certainly suffers when trade is disrupted, that suffering is distributed across the entire Canadian economy. In the United States, the suffering is concentrated in specific states that Trump cannot afford to lose politically. To understand why this crisis has unfolded so differently from previous trade disputes, one must appreciate that Mark Carney represents a fundamentally different type of leader than Trump typically confronts. Carney's background as the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England has shaped his approach to governance in ways that make him particularly effective in this type of economic confrontation. Central bankers think in terms of systems, leverage, and calculated risk. They don't make decisions based on emotion or the news cycle. They make decisions based on long-term strategic positioning and the careful deployment of available tools. When Carney looked at the bridge blockade, he didn't see an insult requiring an emotional response. He saw a miscalculation that created an opportunity to reset the terms of the Canada-US relationship. The pipeline audit represents this calculated approach perfectly. By framing the action as a safety and security measure rather than retaliation, Carney made it legally defensible under existing treaties and politically difficult to oppose. Trump cannot reasonably argue that Canada doesn't have the right to inspect its own infrastructure, especially when American actions have created border instability. Moreover, Carney's approach targets the true power centers in American society. He isn't trying to win a Twitter argument or dominate a news cycle. He's creating economic conditions that will force American corporations, particularly energy companies and manufacturers, to pressure the White House for a resolution. When ExxonMobil, General Motors, and major commodity traders start calling Republican senators demanding that the bridge blockade be lifted, Trump will face pressure that his political base cannot counter. This is a critical distinction. Trump operates in the realm of political theater and popular sentiment. Carney operates in the realm of economic fundamentals and institutional power. In a prolonged confrontation between these two approaches, the economic fundamentals ultimately win because they determine whether businesses can operate and whether people can afford their daily lives. Even if this immediate crisis is resolved within days, if Trump lifts the bridge blockade and Carney concludes his audit, allowing oil to flow normally again, something fundamental has changed in the North American relationship that cannot be easily repaired. For 7 decades following World War II, the United States and Canada operated under what might be called the special relationship of North American economics. The border existed for legal and administrative purposes, but economically, the two nations functioned as an integrated unit. American companies built supply chains that crossed the border multiple times during manufacturing processes, confident that those crossings would remain efficient and reliable. Canadian resources flowed south with the same reliability as resources flowing between American states. This integration created enormous economic efficiency and prosperity on both sides of the border, but it was built on an assumption of mutual trust and respect. Trump's actions have shattered that assumption. By treating Canada not as a trusted partner, but as a potential adversary to be coerced, and by demonstrating a willingness to weaponize border infrastructure for political purposes, Trump has forced Canadian leaders to reconsider the wisdom of deep economic integration with an unreliable partner. If Canada decides that the United States cannot be trusted to maintain stable and respectful trade relations, the long-term implications for the American economy are substantial. Canada will begin diversifying its export markets, building infrastructure to ship resources to Asia and Europe rather than solely to the United States. Canadian companies will reduce their exposure to American supply chains, seeking more reliable partners elsewhere. This diversification will make everything more expensive for American consumers and manufacturers. When Canadian lumber goes primarily to Asia instead of to American homebuilders, lumber prices in the United States rise. When Canadian aluminum is sold on global markets rather than preferentially to American manufacturers, aluminum becomes more expensive. When Canadian agricultural products are shipped overseas rather than south, food prices increase. Beyond specific commodities, this represents a massive increase in economic uncertainty and risk. Companies make investment decisions based on their confidence in supply chain stability. If the Canada-US border becomes unpredictable, companies will demand higher returns on investments that depend on cross-border trade to compensate for the increased risk. This risk premium gets passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices for virtually everything. Possible scenarios and outcomes. As this crisis continues to develop, there are several possible trajectories, each with significantly different implications for both nations and for individual Americans concerned about gas prices and economic stability. The first possibility is what might be called the quiet fold scenario. In this outcome, Trump recognizes that he has made a serious strategic error, but cannot admit fault publicly without damaging his political brand. Instead, he declares victory over some minor concession. Perhaps Canada agrees to enhanced security cooperation or additional reporting requirements, and quietly orders the bridge blockade lifted. Carney completes his audit on a similar timeline, certifies the pipelines as secure, and normal oil flow resumes. This scenario would allow both leaders to claim they achieved their objectives while avoiding prolonged economic damage. Gas prices would stabilize after a brief spike, and the immediate crisis would pass. However, the underlying damage to the relationship would remain. Canadian policymakers would understand that the United States views border infrastructure as a tool of coercion, and future Canadian governments would prioritize reducing their vulnerability to such tactics. The second possibility is escalation. Trump's political brand is built substantially on never backing down and never admitting error. If he perceives the gas price increases as humiliating, he might respond by intensifying the pressure on Canada, rather than seeking an off-ramp. This could involve comprehensive tariffs on Canadian goods, seizure of Canadian assets in the United States, or other aggressive economic measures. If Trump escalates, Carney would likely respond by halting oil exports entirely under force majeure provisions, legal justifications for breaking contracts due to extraordinary circumstances. The Canadian dollar would suffer, and the Canadian economy would enter recession. But the American Midwest would face immediate and severe fuel shortages. Gas stations would run dry, airlines would cancel flights, and manufacturing facilities would shut down. The American economy would likely enter recession within weeks. The third possibility is what might be termed a corporate intervention. Major American corporations that depend on Canadian energy and cross-border supply chains might decide they cannot accept the uncertainty and economic damage that this confrontation is creating. These corporations could pressure Republican senators and representatives to intervene, threatening to withhold political donations and support unless Congress acts to resolve the crisis. This scenario would represent a significant erosion of presidential authority, with Congress effectively overriding executive branch foreign policy to protect corporate interests. It would demonstrate that Trump's hold on his own party has limits when economic fundamentals are threatened. Regardless of which specific scenario plays out in the coming days, the fundamental lesson of this crisis is already clear. The assumption that Canada would always remain a quiet, compliant, junior partner in the North American relationship has been shattered. Canadian leaders have learned that their control over resources that the American economy depends upon gives them significant leverage, and they have demonstrated a willingness to use that leverage when Canadian sovereignty and interests are threatened. For ordinary Americans, this shift means that the era of cheap, reliable, and largely invisible cross-border trade is ending. Future administrations will need to treat Canada with greater respect and consideration, not out of diplomatic nicety, but out of economic necessity. The alternative is recurring crises similar to the current one, with American consumers and businesses paying the price through higher costs and economic instability. This crisis also demonstrates a broader truth about 21st century geopolitics. In an interconnected global economy, traditional measures of national power like military strength or GDP size don't fully capture the leverage that nations possess. A country that controls critical resources or occupies key positions in global supply chains can exercise influence far beyond what its size would suggest. Trump's approach to international relations has been based largely on the assumption that because America has the world's largest economy and most powerful military, it can dictate terms to smaller nations without facing serious consequences. The current crisis with Canada demonstrates the flaw in this assumption. When smaller nations control resources that larger nations cannot easily replace, and when those nations are willing to accept economic costs to defend their interests, traditional measures of power become less relevant. For Americans concerned about the immediate practical implications of this crisis, the message is clear. Watch the gas prices carefully in the coming days. If prices continue to spike and availability begins to decrease, we may be entering a period of genuine fuel scarcity in the Midwest, with cascading effects throughout the economy. The deeper message, however, transcends the immediate crisis over one bridge and one pipeline audit. We are witnessing a fundamental recalibration of the North American relationship, forced by a confrontation that has exposed vulnerabilities and dependencies that both nations previously preferred to leave unexamined. The outcome of this crisis will shape North American economic relations for decades to come, determining whether the extraordinary integration of the past 70 years continues or whether we enter an era of greater separation and independence. As this situation continues to develop, the question facing both nations is whether cooler heads will prevail and find a path back to stable cooperation, or whether pride and political calculations will push this confrontation beyond the point where easy resolution is possible. For now, the traffic backs up at the Ambassador Bridge, the pipelines flow at reduced capacity, and gas prices tick steadily upward. Physical manifestations of a relationship in crisis and a partnership whose future has become suddenly uncertain.